I held the hand of a lonely, dying man in the hospital. He told me his own son had abandoned him 20 years ago. My heart broke for him. Days later, I went to introduce him to my fiancé, and I realized the lonely man in that bed was my fiancé's estranged billionaire father, and he had just decided to make me a part of his final, life-altering plan. Before we get into it, I'd love to know, what city are you watching from today? And be sure to subscribe for more stories every day. Okay, let's head to that hospital room. My life as a nurse in the oncology wing of St. Jude's Hospital was a study in contrasts. It was a world of profound sadness and incredible strength, of quiet goodbyes and fierce small victories. My fiancé, Noah, a kind and gentle history professor, was my anchor in that often stormy sea. Our life together was simple, quiet, and happy, a perfect counterbalance to the emotional weight of my job. We didn't have much money, but we had a deep and abiding love and a future that felt bright and full of promise. I had no idea that my simple life was about to intersect with a family drama of such epic, heartbreaking proportions. It all started with the patient in the penthouse suite. His name was Mr. Sinclair, and he was a legend in the hospital, a ghost that the other nurses only spoke of in hushed, frustrated whispers. He was a reclusive billionaire, a titan of industry, who was now in the final stages of a battle with a rare, aggressive cancer. He was surrounded by the best that money could buy, a private suite that looked more like a five-star hotel room, round-the-clock specialists, the finest medical equipment. But he was utterly, completely, and profoundly alone. He was by all accounts a difficult patient. He was gruff, demanding, and had a tongue as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. He had burned through a half-dozen private nurses in the last month alone, his cold, dismissive fury sending each one of them running in tears. The other nurses on the floor warned me to stay away from him. "He's a monster, Tessa," my friend Maria had told me. "He's rich, he's lying, and he wants to make everyone as miserable as he is." But one afternoon, as I was passing his room, I heard a sound that stopped me in my tracks. It was not the sound of anger. It was the sound of a man quietly, desperately weeping. I hesitated for only a moment. Then I pushed the door open and stepped inside. He was sitting in a large armchair by the window, a frail old man dwarfed by the luxury of his surroundings, his face buried in his hands. "Mr. Sinclair?" I said softly. He looked up, his eyes, a startlingly intelligent and piercing blue, full of a fierce, immediate anger at being seen in his moment of vulnerability. "What do you want?" he rasped. "Get out." "I heard you crying," I said simply, not moving. "I just wanted to see if you needed anything." "I don't need anything from you," he snarled. "Okay," I said, my voice still gentle. "I'll just sit here with you for a bit. No one should have to be alone when they're in pain." He stared at me, his eyes wide with a stunned, baffled surprise. He was clearly not used to people who were not intimidated by him. He didn't speak again for a long time, and I just sat there, in the quiet, sunlit room, the only sound the soft, rhythmic beeping of his monitors. It was the beginning of our strange and unlikely friendship. I started spending my breaks in his room. I learned that beneath the gruff, angry exterior was a man of incredible intellect and profound, bottomless regret. He told me about his life, about the empire he had built from nothing, and he told me about his greatest failure, his son. "He was a good boy," he told me one afternoon, his voice a low, gravelly whisper as he stared out at the city skyline. "But he was soft, gentle. He loved books and history and poetry. I tried to toughen him up. I tried to make him a businessman, a killer, like me." He shook his head, a look of ancient, weary sadness on his face. "But he wasn't built for my world. He refused to join my company. He called it a moral compromise. He chose his books over his own father." He told me about their final, terrible argument 20 years ago, the harsh, unforgivable words they had exchanged.
The son had walked away, and the father, in a fit of proud, wounded rage, had let him go. He had disowned him, and he had not seen or spoken to him since. "I have all the money in the world," he whispered, a single hot tear rolling down his wrinkled cheek, "and I am dying alone. Tell me, nurse, what was the point of it all?" My heart ached for him, this lonely old king on his mountain of regrets. It also ached for the son, the quiet, gentle boy who had been rejected by his own father for simply being who he was. That night, on the phone with my own fiancé, Noah, I told him about my patient. "He's the saddest man I have ever met," I said. "He's so full of regret about his son, it's heartbreaking." Noah, my kind, empathetic Noah, listened patiently. "It's a tragic story," he agreed. "Pride is a terrible, lonely prison." I had an idea then, a simple, hopeful thought. "You know," I said, "you two would actually get along so well. He loves history as much as you do. You should come by the hospital tomorrow. I'd love for you to meet him. Maybe you could cheer him up." There was a strange, tense silence on the other end of the line. "What's the man's name, Tessa?" Noah asked, his voice suddenly odd. "Augustus Sinclair," I said cheerfully. "Why?" The silence that followed was longer this time, and it was heavier. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a choked, strangled whisper I barely recognized. "Tessa, my full name, you know my full name is Noah Vance Sinclair." The world seemed to stop. Vance was his mother's maiden name, the name he had chosen to use professionally. But his real name, Sinclair? I thought of the story of the soft son who loved history, who had been disowned 20 years ago, and my blood turned to ice. "My God," I whispered. "Noah? Is he—" "Yes, Tessa," he replied, his voice full of a pain I had never heard before. "The lonely old man you've been caring for in the hospital, he's the father who has refused to speak to me for the last 20 years. The silence on the other end of the phone was a living thing. It was a silence filled with 20 years of pain, of rejection, of a father-son relationship that had been amputated and left to fester. When my fiancé Noah finally spoke, his voice was a low, strangled whisper I barely recognized. "Where?" he asked. "Where is he?" "St. Jude's," I replied, softly. "He's my patient, Noah, in the oncology wing." "The universe," he said, with a short, bitter, and utterly heartbreaking laugh. He didn't ask if his father was okay. He didn't ask what was wrong with him. The wound was too old, too deep for that. "I don't want to see him," he said, his voice now a cold, hard stone. "He made his choice 20 years ago. He is nothing to me." And then before I could reply, he hung up. I stood in the quiet hallway of my own apartment, the dial tone buzzing in my ear, and I felt the full, crushing weight of the impossible situation I had just stumbled into. I was in love with a man who had been profoundly and deeply wounded by his father, and I had, through a bizarre twist of fate, formed a genuine, compassionate bond with the very man who had inflicted that wound. I was not just a nurse, not just a fiancé. I was now the sole, unwilling bridge between two strangers who happened to be father and son, a bridge that spanned a 20-year chasm of pain and pride. The next day at the hospital was the most difficult of my career. I walked into Mr. Sinclair's, into Augustus's room, and the dynamic between us was completely and irrevocably changed. He was no longer just my difficult, lonely patient. He was the father of the man I loved, the source of a pain that was now intimately a part of my own life. He knew, the moment I walked in, that I had spoken to Noah. His eyes, usually so guarded and cynical, were now wide with a desperate, fearful, and almost childlike hope. "You told him?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. I nodded, my heart aching for him, for both of them. "I did." "And?" he pressed, leaning forward in his bed. "Is he coming? Will he see me?" I had to tell him the truth. "He's angry, Augustus," I said gently. "The hurt it's still very raw. He said he doesn't want to see you." The flicker of hope in his eyes died, and it was one of the saddest things I have ever witnessed. He sank back against his pillows, a frail old man, defeated. "I see," he whispered. "I suppose I deserve that. I was a terrible father. I tried to mold him into a version of myself, a ruthless businessman. But he was a scholar, a poet. He was a good and gentle boy, and I saw his goodness as a weakness." He looked at me, his eyes swimming with a lifetime of regret. "I broke his heart because he was not like me, and now I am dying alone, and my only comfort is a kind-hearted nurse who is, in every way that matters, exactly like him. The irony is not lost on me, my dear." From that day on, our conversations changed. He would pepper me with questions about Noah. What was he like? Was he happy? What did he teach? Did he ever talk about his father? I answered his questions honestly. I painted a picture for him of the man his son had become, a brilliant, beloved professor, a man respected by his students and adored by his friends, a man who had built a good, honorable, and happy life for himself, not with money, but with his mind and his heart. I was, in a very strange way, reintroducing a father to the son he had never known. As the days turned into a week, I could see his health declining. The fight seemed to be leaving him, and with it, a new, desperate urgency was taking its place. He summoned his lawyer to the hospital. They spent an entire afternoon in his room with the door closed. When the lawyer left, Augustus called me back into his room. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes were full of a new, final, and absolute purpose. "He won't see me," Augustus said, his voice no longer full of sadness, but of a grim resignation. "And he's right not to. I was a monster to him. A man who places the value of a stock portfolio over the value of his own son's soul does not deserve forgiveness." He looked at me, his gaze intense. "But you, Tessa, he loves you. He trusts you, and you were a good and kind woman."
The kind of person I once told him was weak and unfit for the real world. I was a blind, arrogant fool. He then reached over to his bedside table and picked up a thick, heavy, and formally sealed envelope. He held it out to me. "I have made a new plan, Tessa," he said. "A final one. My lawyers have just drafted it. It is my last and only hope for redemption." He pressed the envelope into my hands. It was addressed, in his now shaky script, to Noah Sinclair. "Please," he begged, his voice a raw, broken whisper, his old, powerful hand clutching mine. "Take this. Give it to him. Do not let him just tear it up. Please, my dear, you must make him read it. You are my only hope. You are the only bridge between us now." I looked down at the heavy envelope in my hands. It felt like the weight of a life, of two lives. A dying man's last wish, a father's final, desperate attempt at redemption, a plan that would, I had no doubt, change my own future and Noah's forever. I had to convince the man I loved to finally face the one man he had spent his entire adult life hating. My job was no longer just about healing a patient's body. It was now about healing a wound that was 20 years old and $1 billion deep. I left the hospital room that night with the heavy envelope in my bag. feeling like a messenger carrying a fragile peace treaty between two long-warring nations. The weight was not from the paper. It was the weight of 20 years of pain, of pride, and of unspoken words. My patient, Augustus Sinclair, had entrusted me with his last desperate hope for redemption, and now I had to face the most difficult task of all, to convince the man I loved to finally face the ghost he had spent his entire life trying to outrun. I found Noah in our small, cozy apartment. He was in his study, surrounded by his beloved history books, his safe refuge from the world. He looked up when I entered, and his tired smile faded when he saw the expression on my face. "He spoke to you," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, his voice low and filled with a weary resignation. "Yes," I replied softly. "He did." I walked to his desk, and with hands that were trembling slightly, I placed the heavy envelope on an open book about the Roman Empire. My fiancé's name, Noah Sinclair, was written in his father's shaky script. Noah looked at the envelope as if it were a snake. He made no move to touch it. "I told you, Tessa," he said, his voice hardening. "I don't want anything from him. Not his apologies, not his money, nothing. It is too late." "It's not for him, Noah," I pleaded, my voice soft. "It's for you. 20 years of anger, of pain, that's a poison. You carry that weight with you every single day. I see it in your eyes. Maybe this," I gestured to the letter, "can finally set you free?" "Set me free." He laughed, a short, bitter, and joyless sound. "He is the cage, Tessa. He and his world of power, of money, of cruelty. I escaped that cage 20 years ago. To go back now isn't freedom, it's surrender." The conversation that followed was the most difficult of our relationship. I told him everything. I told him about his father's loneliness, about his profound and corrosive regret. I told him how he spoke of his son, the scholar and the poet, with a pained, admiring awe that he never had the courage to express. And I told him of his last words to me, about how I was exactly like the son he had cast away. "He didn't reject you for being weak, Noah. He rejected you because you were good, because you were everything he was not, and he was afraid of your goodness because it showed him his own lack of it." He was silent for a long time, his anger warring with the hurt he had kept buried for so long. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to come from his soul, he reached for the envelope. He stared at it for a long moment, his father's name a ghost on the page. With an agonizing slowness, he broke the seal. The contents were not what either of us expected. It wasn't just a letter. It was a dossier of documents. On top was a long, multi-page handwritten letter. Beneath it was a thick, formally bound legal document bearing the logo of one of the most powerful law firms in the city. Noah ignored the legal document. He began to read the letter. I watched his face as he read, a silent journey through 20 years of pain. I watched his expression shift from a cold, defensive anger to a shocked confusion, and finally to a deep, overwhelming sadness. I saw his hand, the one holding the letter, begin to tremble. I saw his own tears, the tears he had held captive for 2 decades, finally begin to fall, smudging his father's ink. When he was finished, he didn't say a word. He just handed the pages to me, a silent invitation into his private world of grief. And I read his father's words. It was a confession, a full and unsparing apology, not just for that final day, but for a lifetime of being a terrible father. He wrote of his own difficult past, of his obsession with power and money as a shield against fear. And he wrote of his profound and unending love for the son he had driven away. "I saw in you," Augustus had written, "not weakness, but a strength I never possessed, the strength of integrity, the strength of kindness," and it terrified me.
I tried to destroy in you the one thing I should have nurtured. That is my greatest and most unforgivable sin." After I finished the letter, I picked up the legal document. It was not a will, it was the charter for a new entity, the Sinclair Foundation for the Arts and Humanities. The document was a masterpiece of legal redemption. In it, Augustus had outlined a plan to liquidate his entire business empire, his entire billion-dollar fortune, and he was placing that entire fortune into this new charitable foundation. The foundation's mission? To fund scholarships for history students, to support local museums, to fund archaeological digs, and to sponsor poets and artists. It was a foundation dedicated to all the soft, unprofitable things he had spent his life deriding. It was a foundation that was the embodiment of his son's soul. The turning point, the true reveal, was on the final page. The document named the foundation's board of directors. There were only 2 seats, and he was offering them the co-chairmanships of the Sinclair Foundation to the only 2 people in the world he now trusted to honor his legacy, Noah Sinclair and Tessa Hart. I looked at my fiancé, who was sitting in silent, weeping contemplation of his father's letter. He hadn't disinherited his son. He had done something far more profound. He wasn't giving him his money. He was entrusting him with his legacy. He was asking his son to teach him how to be a better man, even from the grave. The knot of anger in Noah's heart, finally, after 20 years, came undone, washed away by a tide of a sad and complicated understanding. His father had not summoned him for a surrender. He had summoned him for a partnership. He looked at me, his eyes red and full of a new, uncertain emotion. "I think," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "I think I need to go see my father."
The silence in my small, book-lined study after Noah whispered those 5 momentous words, "I think I need to see my father," was a profound and sacred thing. It was the sound of a 20-year-old wall of anger and resentment, a wall he had so carefully constructed around his own heart, finally beginning to crumble. I didn't rush him. I didn't offer words of encouragement. I just sat with him in the quiet, respectful silence, giving him the space to process the seismic shift that had just occurred within him. The father he had spent a lifetime hating had, in a single, beautifully written letter, become a man he was beginning to understand. The drive to the hospital was the most tense and silent journey of our lives. It was not the angry silence of a fight, but a heavy, fragile silence, thick with unspoken emotions, with 2 decades of pain and questions that were about to be confronted. Noah stared out the passenger window, his face a pale, grim mask. I could only imagine the war that was raging inside him, the hurt little boy who had been rejected, and the grown man now grappling with a father's profound and final act of contrition. We walked through the sterile, antiseptic-smelling corridors of the hospital, our footsteps echoing in the late-night quiet. For me, it was a familiar path, the route to my patient's room. For Noah, it was a long, green mile, each step bringing him closer to the ghost he had spent his life trying to escape. We reached the door to his father's private suite. Noah stopped, his hand hovering over the handle, his body frozen with a sudden, overwhelming hesitation. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a lifetime of fear and anger. "I don't know if I can do this, Tessa," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "What if I look at him and all I can feel is the hate?" I took his trembling hand in mine. "Then you feel the hate, Noah," I said softly. "Whatever you feel is okay. But you are not the same boy he cast out 20 years ago. You are a good, strong, and brilliant man. He doesn't hold that power over you anymore. You are walking into that room as his equal. Go in there and let him see the man you have become,
not in spite of him, but because of who you are." He took a deep, shuddering breath, squeezed my hand one last time, and then he pushed the door open. Augustus Sinclair was not asleep. He was sitting up in his hospital bed, propped up by a mountain of pillows, staring at the door as if he had been waiting for us. He looked smaller, frailer than I had ever seen him. The powerful, gruff billionaire was gone. In his place was just a dying old man, his eyes, those sharp, intelligent blue eyes, wide with a naked, desperate hope. I watched as father and son looked at each other for the first time in 20 years. The air in the room was thick with the weight of that silence, with the gravity of 2 decades of unspoken words. It was Augustus who spoke first, his voice a dry, papery rasp. "Noah, you came." Noah didn't move from the doorway. He just stood there, his body rigid. "I read your letter," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. Another long, heavy silence. "I was a fool," Augustus whispered, tears beginning to well in his old, tired eyes. "I was a proud, arrogant, and terrified fool. I built an empire of steel and glass, but I let my own heart turn to stone. I saw your kindness, your gentleness as a weakness. I didn't realize until it was far too late that it was the greatest strength in the world, a strength I never had." Noah finally took a step into the room, and then another. He walked to his father's bedside. "Why?" Noah asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you push me away? Why was it so easy for you to just throw me out of your life?"
"Because it wasn't easy," Augustus cried, a sob catching in his throat. "It was the hardest and stupidest thing I have ever done. I pushed you away because you were a living, breathing mirror to my own failings. You were a good and decent soul, and I was a man who had compromised his own soul for the sake of profit and power. It was easier to call you a failure than to admit that I was one." The confession, so raw, so honest, so full of a lifetime of pain, seemed to finally break through Noah's own defenses. He sank into the chair beside his father's bed, his own face now wet with tears. They were not the angry tears of a rejected son, but the sad, grieving tears of a man who was finally, after 20 years, beginning to mourn the father he had lost so long ago. They talked for hours. Noah spoke of his own pain, of the profound loneliness of his youth, of the constant, aching feeling of his father's rejection, and Augustus listened, not with excuses, but with a quiet, heartbreaking acceptance of his own crimes. They talked about the foundation. "I don't want your money, Dad," said Noah. "It's not my money anymore," Augustus replied, a faint, tired smile on his lips. "It is my legacy, and it is worthless without a soul to guide it. You are my soul, son. You and that remarkable woman you have brought into our lives. I am not asking you to take my money. I am begging you to take my legacy and to transform it, to turn it into something good, something you can be proud of." In the early hours of the morning, as the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the window, a sudden, jarring alarm began to beep from one of the monitors beside the bed. Augustus's breath became shallow, his eyes fluttering shut. His heart, which had carried the heavy burden of his regret for so long, was finally and peacefully giving out. I rushed to his side, my nurse's training taking over. But he just shook his head, a final, weak gesture. He reached out a trembling hand, and Noah took it. He then reached out his other hand, and I took that one. He died in that quiet, sunlit room, not alone, but with his son holding one hand, and with me, the kind stranger who had become his daughter, holding the other. He had died at peace, his great, final, and most important deal finally closed. The long 20-year war between father and son was finally over. The great Augustus Sinclair was gone.
But he had left behind a billion-dollar question, a vast and complicated legacy, and the most difficult and most beautiful job in the world for us, figuring out what to do next. I stood in the quiet, sterile hospital room, a silent witness to the end of a 20-year war. My fiancé, Noah, held his father's hand, his shoulders shaking with a grief that was as complex and as deep as the ocean. He was not just mourning the man who had died in that bed, he was mourning the man he had never known, the father he had lost 2 decades ago, and the fragile, beautiful connection they had managed to forge in the final, fleeting hours of a long and difficult life. The days that followed were a quiet, somber affair. The funeral was not the grand, ostentatious spectacle that would have marked the passing of the billionaire Augustus Sinclair. Instead, it was a small, private service, attended only by a handful of his oldest, truest friends. And by us, Noah gave the eulogy. He did not speak of his father's empire, or his wealth, or his power. He spoke of the man from the letters, the man that I had come to know, a man of profound regrets, of a brilliant mind, and of a deep, if tragically misguided love for his son. It was a eulogy of forgiveness, of understanding, and of a peace that had been hard won.
The official reading of the will, a few days later, was a mere formality, a quiet meeting in Mr. Davis's office. The legal language simply confirmed what we already knew. The vast, ruthless, and sprawling empire of Sinclair Industries was to be dissolved, and its entire multi-billion-dollar net worth was to be funneled into a single new entity, the Sinclair Foundation for the Arts and Humanities. And its future, its mission, its very soul was now in our hands. The task before us was monumental, almost overwhelming. We were not just managing a charity, we were dismantling a legacy of corporate ruthlessness and rebuilding it, brick by painful brick, into a legacy of compassion. It was a full-time job, and we threw ourselves into it. Noah, with his deep scholarly knowledge of history and the arts, was the foundation's visionary. He knew which struggling museums to support, which historical preservation projects were most vital, which young artists and writers were most deserving of a grant. He was in his element, his passion for his subject now backed by the resources to make a real, tangible difference in the world. I, with my practical nurse's understanding of human needs and my quiet, organizational mind, became the foundation's heart. I managed the logistics, I vetted the grant applications, I built the relationships with the communities we were trying to serve. We were a perfect team. We were partners, in every sense of the word. Our first major project was a testament to our shared vision. We used the Foundation's first significant disbursement to purchase and restore an old, beautiful, but neglected historical building in the heart of the city's most underserved neighborhood. And in it, we created something new. The bottom floor became the new state-of-the-art home for a free health clinic, a nod to my own life's work. And the top floor became a beautiful, sunlit museum and library dedicated to the city's local history, a tribute to Noah's passion. It was a place for healing bodies and nurturing minds, all under one roof. The Sinclair Foundation was no longer just an idea on a piece of paper. It was a living, breathing force for good. Our wedding, when it happened a year after his father's death, was a small, quiet, and deeply meaningful ceremony. We did not get married in a grand cathedral or a fancy country club. We were married on the steps of the new museum we had built together, surrounded by a small group of our closest friends and the community we were now a part of. During his vows, Noah looked at me, his eyes full of a love so profound it was a tangible thing. My father, at the very end of his life, he said, his voice thick with emotion, taught me about the power of redemption. He taught me that it is never too late to try and make things right. He then squeezed my hand. And you, Tessa, you taught me about the power of forgiveness,
You taught me that a heart, no matter how broken, can always be healed. You are the kindest and the strongest person I have ever known. I looked at my husband, at this good and whole and wonderful man, and I thought about the strange, impossible journey that had brought us here. I had taken a job as a nurse, a simple act of showing up for work. I had shown a small, simple kindness to a lonely, dying old man. And that single, unremarkable act of compassion had set in motion a chain of events that had healed a 20-year-old family wound, redeemed a billion-dollar legacy, and led me to this, to a love that was deeper and more real than I had ever imagined.
Augustus Sinclair's final gift was not his money. It was his trust. The trust he placed in his son and in the kind-hearted stranger who had shown him the way back home. And that was an inheritance, I knew, that would last forever. An absolutely beautiful and moving story about the power of forgiveness and how it's never too late to make things right. What do you think of the father's final act of redemption? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were touched by this incredible story of healing and a new beginning, please show your support by hitting that like button and be sure to subscribe for more powerful and emotional stories. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.